What if one destroyed city quietly stopped Russia's next march toward Kiev? What if just 20 exhausted Russian soldiers trapped inside a ruined hospital were actually the last barrier preventing an entirely new northern offensive? Kupiansk became a slaughterhouse, where FPV drones hunted million-dollar tanks, underground bunkers turned into tombs, and elite Russian units vanished beneath shattered streets. As thermal drones scanned every rooftop and sewer tunnel, Ukraine systematically dismantled Moscow's defenses piece by piece. Then the shock came. Russia wasn't just losing territory. It was losing time, reserves, momentum, and possibly its final realistic path back to Kiev. Kupiansk was never just another frontline town. Sitting along the Oskil River, it controlled critical supply routes flowing from Belgorod into northern Luhansk and the upper Donbass. As long as Russia held the city, Ukraine was forced to commit major forces to the northeast, while Moscow maintained pressure on Kharkiv and concealed troop movements farther north. Kupiansk acted like a strategic hinge. As long as it held, Russia could stabilize the northeastern front while quietly preparing something larger behind the scenes. But when Ukrainian forces broke through in May 2026, that hinge snapped open. Russian commanders suddenly faced a dangerous dilemma: either allow the northeastern line to collapse or divert reserves originally intended for future operations elsewhere. Elite units were rushed southward. Hidden concentrations near the border became harder to conceal, and the timeline for Russia's northern ambitions began falling apart. A battle that appeared local was now reshaping the entire war. By early 2026, Russia could no longer rely on large mechanized assaults around Kupiansk. Instead, the battlefield descended into a brutal underground war. Russian troops occupied basements, sewer tunnels, factory bunkers, and collapsed apartment blocks. Entire defensive systems were built beneath the ruins of the city. Kupiansk stopped functioning like a normal urban battlefield. It became a subterranean maze. At night, Ukrainian thermal drones floated silently over shattered streets, while FPV drones hunted movement between buildings. Civilians had long disappeared. The only sounds left were artillery impacts, drone motors, and distant gunfire echoing through hollow apartment blocks. Russian soldiers survived underground like ghosts. What had once been homes, schools, and hospitals slowly transformed into fortified kill zones. But the deeper question was becoming impossible to ignore. If Kupiansk was only one city, why was Moscow willing to sacrifice so many elite troops just to hold it? Because hidden behind the battle for these ruined streets was something much larger than Kupiansk itself. A plan that may have been designed to bring the war back to the gates of Kiev. And if you're enjoying this documentary analysis so far, consider subscribing, because the next phase of this story reveals why the collapse of one eastern city may have changed the future of the entire war. Ukraine avoided the mistake Russia had made repeatedly throughout the war, rushing directly into fortified urban positions. Instead, Ukrainian forces slowly dismantled the Russian defense network over months. First came reconnaissance. Drones mapped bunker entrances, tunnels, supply routes, and movement corridors. Thermal surveillance exposed hidden positions once considered safe. Then came isolation. Ukrainian strikes targeted logistics routes from Belgorod, ammunition depots, communications nodes, and crossings over the Oskil River. Russian strongpoints became increasingly cut off from one another. Only then came destruction. Factory basements, underground shelters, and fortified buildings were reduced one pocket at a time through coordinated FPV drone strikes, artillery fire, and close-quarters assault teams. Russian troops were no longer defending one unified city. They were surviving inside isolated islands of resistance. And isolated defenders eventually run out of time. The last major Russian resistance centered around Kupiansk's central hospital. The building had become a fortress of shattered corridors, sniper nests, machine gun positions, and underground firing points. Around 20 exhausted Russian soldiers remained trapped inside. Ukrainian drones carefully studied the structure from above. Every window, every heat signature, every escape tunnel. Ukraine sealed retreat routes and cut the final supply access across the river. Russian defenders inside the hospital began losing communication with the outside world. Then the final assault began. FPV drones burst through broken windows. Precision artillery collapsed defensive positions floor by floor. Loitering munitions struck hardened firing points with surgical accuracy. Inside the darkness of the hospital, Russian resistance slowly fragmented into terrified pockets of isolated survivors. One Ukrainian operator later described the battle simply, "The building stopped sounding like a fortress. It started sounding empty." When the hospital finally fell silent, organized Russian resistance inside Kupiansk effectively ended. And this was only the beginning. Behind the fortress walls of the Kremlin, the sudden silence from Kupiansk's central hospital didn't just signal a local defeat, it detonated a full-blown operational panic. For months, Russian state television had framed the northeastern meat grinder as a controlled war of attrition, but behind closed doors, military maps were bleeding red. The Oskil River line had not just bent, it had completely severed. Military logisticians in Moscow watched in horror as the tactical retreat quickly dissolved into a supply chain nightmare. The loss of Kupiansk instantly paralyzed the railway hubs connecting Belgorod to the Donbass, turning a highly organized, multi-theater staging area into a massive bottleneck of stranded armor. General staff maps that had meticulously detailed the timelines for a lightning thrust toward Chernihiv and Kiev were suddenly rendered useless. The high-stakes gamble relied on seamless, unmapped logistics, but the battlefield transparency achieved by Ukrainian drone operators meant that every panicked Russian movement to reinforce the buckling northeastern front was broadcast in high definition to Ukrainian artillery commanders. The illusion of an endless Russian supply chain was dying in the mud of the Oskil, and with it, the strategic coherence of the entire 2026 summer campaign. On the ground, after losing control of the city, Russian forces attempted a different strategy. Small infiltration groups, often just one or two soldiers, tried slipping back into Kupiansk through forests, riverbanks, drainage systems, and industrial pipelines beneath the Oskil River. Years earlier, such tactics might have worked, but modern drone warfare had changed the battlefield completely. Ukraine maintained nearly continuous aerial surveillance using reconnaissance drones, thermal cameras, motion sensors, and FPV strike units waiting overhead. Russian soldiers quickly discovered something terrifying. Darkness no longer protected them. Some infiltration teams disappeared before even firing a shot. Others were detected simply by body heat glowing against cold terrain on Ukrainian thermal screens. The battlefield had become transparent. And once a battlefield becomes transparent, hiding becomes almost impossible. At the beginning of 2026, Russia still possessed advantages in manpower, artillery volume, and offensive pressure. But Ukraine adapted faster. Every Russian tactical adjustment survived only briefly before Ukrainian forces developed a counter. Underground bunkers became vulnerable to thermal reconnaissance. Small infiltration teams became easier to track through drone surveillance. FPV operators coordinated directly with infantry assaults in real time. Ukraine was no longer simply defending positions. It was building an evolving battlefield ecosystem where Russian adaptation itself became increasingly difficult. That may have been the most dangerous shift for Moscow. Russia still had numbers. Ukraine had learning speed. The fall of Kupiansk inflicted losses far beyond destroyed equipment. Elements of Russia's 1st Tank Army, 6th Combined Arms Army, and veteran mechanized brigades suffered devastating casualties during months of urban fighting. Tanks can eventually be replaced. Veteran crews cannot. Experienced officers, coordinated assault teams, battle-hardened drone operators, and mid-level commanders represent institutional military memory developed through years of war. Kupiansk consumed that experience at a rate Russia struggled to replace. The city did not simply grind down Russian armor, it ground down the professional backbone of Russia's offensive forces. While global attention focused on the fighting in Kupiansk, Ukrainian intelligence increasingly believed Moscow was preparing something larger in the north. According to those assessments, Russia hoped to stabilize the Eastern Front while quietly assembling a massive reserve force near Chernihiv for a future offensive toward Kiev. The strategy depended on three critical conditions: a stable northeastern front, operational secrecy, and enough time to build combat power. Kupiansk destroyed all three. As Russian positions collapsed, Moscow was forced to divert reserves away from the northern axis. The movement exposed operational intentions while buying Ukraine precious time to strengthen defenses around Chernihiv and Kiev. What looked like a tactical defeat in the east was becoming a strategic disaster for Russia's broader war plan. Once Kupiansk fell, the consequences spread quickly. Every battalion rushed south to stabilize the Oskil line, weakened Russia's northern preparations. Every destroyed armored unit reduced offensive capacity elsewhere. Meanwhile, Ukraine gained exactly what it needed most: time. Time to reinforce defensive lines, time to deploy additional drone units, time to expand electronic warfare systems, time to prepare the northern frontier. The eastern collapse slowly drained momentum from Russia's northern ambitions before the offensive could even begin. As battle-hardened Ukrainian units redeployed from Kupiansk toward Chernihiv, they joined one of the most heavily fortified defensive systems in modern Europe. The northern defensive zone stretched for hundreds of kilometers and included reinforced bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, underground logistics routes, layered trench systems, and electronic warfare coverage designed to disrupt Russian drones and communications. But the real strength of the defense was not concrete. It was experience. The soldiers arriving from Kupiansk brought with them months of hard-earned urban combat knowledge. They understood Russian infiltration tactics, drone patterns, and battlefield behavior in ways impossible to teach quickly. Russia was no longer facing unprepared defenders. It was facing troops who had already survived one of the most brutal urban battles of the war. A successful strike toward Kiev would require surprise, speed, concentration of force, and weak defenses. Kupiansk weakened all four. Russian reserves were diverted, timelines were disrupted, preparations became increasingly visible, and Ukrainian defenses in the north continued growing stronger. But perhaps the greatest loss was psychological. Russian commanders increasingly understood that their movements were being watched, anticipated, and countered before operations fully developed. A secret offensive stops being a lightning strike the moment the enemy sees it coming. Russia originally fought for Kupiansk to pin Ukrainian forces in the northeast and prevent reinforcement elsewhere. Instead, the battle consumed Russia's own reserves. The campaign designed to distract Ukraine ultimately forced Moscow itself into a reactive position. And in modern war, once the attacker begins reacting instead of dictating events, initiative slowly begins to disappear. Kupiansk also revealed something larger about the future of warfare itself. Modern war no longer only destroys cities, it changes human behavior. Soldiers learned never to move carelessly beneath open skies. Civilians learned to recognize drone sounds before they recognized approaching vehicles. Entire routines of daily life adapted around aerial surveillance and sudden precision strikes. For many people near the front, war no longer arrived in massive offensives. It hovered constantly overhead. Despite Ukraine's success, Kupiansk remained a devastated city. Hospitals became fortresses, apartment blocks became sniper positions, underground shelters became tombs for soldiers trapped beneath collapsing buildings. Behind every strategic success remained shattered communities forced to rebuild after months of destruction. Victory may protect capitals, but it also leaves behind cities where normal life may take years to return. Russia's broader strategy appeared simple: fix Ukrainian forces in the east, quietly build offensive power in the north, then threaten Kiev once again. But Kupiansk disrupted that strategy. Russian strongholds collapsed, elite formations suffered heavy losses, reserves were redirected. Ukraine reinforced the northern frontier and transformed Chernihiv into a hardened defensive zone. Kupiansk may ultimately be remembered as more than a victory in eastern Ukraine. It may be remembered as the battle that quietly destroyed Moscow's last realistic road back to Kiev. As the front line shifted, an invisible but equally devastating shockwave rippled through Russia's financial underground. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, the amoral algorithms of the domestic bond markets and elite sovereign wealth funds caught the scent of blood long before the public headlines hit. The Kiev premium, The economic expectation among Russia's billionaire oligarchs that a renewed northern offensive would force Ukraine into a resource-rich surrender evaporated overnight. Russian war bonds, heavily leveraged on the promise of a decisive 2026 victory, suffered a catastrophic sell-off. Intelligence reports began tracking a silent, desperate migration of capital as elite families quietly shifted assets into alternative non-aligned havens in Dubai and Central Asia. The message from Russia's economic engine was clear. They no longer believed the military could deliver on its grand geopolitical promises. When a nation's financial elite begins pricing in a permanent war of attrition rather than a glorious march toward the enemy's capital, the psychological foundation of total war mobilization starts to fracture. By dismantling the strategic hinge at Kupiansk, Ukraine didn't just break a line of concrete and trenches, they broke the economic will of the very men funding Moscow's imperial machinery. And if Kiev remains secure after the summer of 2026, part of the answer may lie far from the capital itself, inside the shattered hospitals, ruined apartment blocks, and underground tunnels beneath Kupiansk. The battle for Kupiansk may one day be remembered as far more than a local victory in eastern Ukraine. It may be remembered as the moment Moscow's road back to Kiev quietly began to disappear. But history is still unfolding in real time. And if you want more deep geopolitical documentaries and frontline war analysis like this, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Because the next turning point in this war may already be happening right now.